Stop scrolling. Because what I'm about to explain is not a theory, not a prediction, and not a future scenario. It is already happening, quietly, legally, and at a scale so large that most people can't even comprehend it. Over the next decade, more than $45 trillion will move from one group of people to another, not through innovation, not through productivity, not through entrepreneurship, but through policy, demographics, and financial structure. And almost nobody sees it coming. While headlines argue about elections, inflation, and interest rates, the largest wealth transfer in modern history is being engineered in plain sight. A shift so massive that it will permanently redefine who owns assets, who controls markets, and who gets priced out forever. This is not about getting rich. It's about not being erased. Because if you don't understand how this 45 trillion wealth shift works, where it's coming from, who it's moving to, and why speed matters, you will be on the wrong side of it by default. Let me be clear about something before we go any further. This wealth shift is not optional. You cannot vote it away. You cannot stop it. You can only position yourself before it fully materializes, or react after it's already done. In this investigation, we're not making predictions, we're not guessing timelines, we're following the money, using hard data, demographic math, central bank balance sheets, and asset ownership trends. By the end of this video, you will understand why $45 trillion is about to move, and why it's accelerating now, why traditional savers and middle-class households are the primary losers, why asset owners are being silently protected, and what decisions matter right now, not years from now. Because once this shift becomes obvious to the mainstream, it will already be too late to benefit from it. This is not a warning, this is documentation. Let us start with where the 45 trillion number actually comes from, and why it's not exaggerated. Who wins, who loses, and why. Inaction is a choice. At this stage of the wealth shift, the divide is no longer between people who are informed and people who are uninformed. It is between people who are positioned and people who are exposed. Most losses in this transition will not come from bad decisions. They will come from no decisions at all. That is the uncomfortable truth. The primary winners of this shift are not brilliant traders or visionary entrepreneurs. They are entities designed to survive volatility, institutions with permanent capital, long-time horizons, and structural advantages embedded into policy. Asset managers benefit because scale changes everything. They borrow cheaper. They diversify globally. They hedge risk systematically. They are not dependent on a single market, employer, or asset class. When conditions change, they rebalance rather than retreat. Private equity benefits because it operates outside public market constraints. It acquires assets at negotiated prices, restructures them, and holds through cycles. It thrives when family businesses are forced to sell, when public markets undervalue cash flow, and when complexity scares off individual buyers. Real estate investment vehicles benefit because housing scarcity is not cyclical, it is structural. Zoning restrictions, demographic pressure, and underbuilding ensure long-term demand. When households cannot buy, they rent. Rent becomes a durable cash flow. Cash flow becomes valuation. Pension systems benefit because they are politically protected. Contributions continue. Assets are reallocated. Losses are amortized over decades. Individuals do not have that luxury. Now look at who loses. Wage-dependent households lose first. Their income adjusts slowly. Inflation erodes purchasing power immediately. When costs rise faster than wages, savings become survival buffers rather than investment capital. Cash savers lose quietly. Inflation taxes idle money without legislation. What feels like safety becomes exposure. Purchasing power leaks away invisibly. Late entrants lose structurally. Waiting for better prices in an environment of asset scarcity and institutional demand is not patience. It is miscalculation. Markets do not return to affordability when capital concentration increases. They return to equilibrium under new ownership. The most dangerous assumption is that traditional advice still applies. Advice like, wait for a pullback, don't chase assets, or stay liquid until things stabilize, was formed in an era when ownership was broader and credit cycles behaved differently. Today, liquidity is not neutral. It is optionality only if you can deploy it faster than institutions. Most individuals cannot. When markets fall, margin calls force selling. Job insecurity increases. Credit tightens. The moment when assets appear cheapest is often the moment when individuals are least able to buy. Institutions anticipate this. They raise cash ahead of time. They arrange financing. They preposition. This is not unfair. It is structural. Now consider the role of time. This wealth shift does not happen in months. It unfolds over years. That is precisely why it is underestimated. Gradual change feels temporary. People assume normalization is coming. Normalization does not restore ownership. It locks it in. By the time stability returns, assets are already concentrated. Entry requires leverage. Leverage increases risk. Risk discourages participation. This is how generations diverge economically without obvious crises. Another critical factor is financialization. Assets today are not just owned, they are layered. A single home may be owned by a trust, financed by a fund, securitized into a product, and traded indirectly through portfolios. This complexity favors professionals. It distances individuals from ownership. As financial instruments proliferate, access narrows. Ownership becomes abstracted. Control becomes centralized. This is not conspiracy. It is efficiency. Efficiency concentrates power. Now ask the most important question. Where does this leave someone who is not already wealthy? It does not mean exclusion is inevitable. It means strategy matters. Positioning does not require perfect timing. It requires exposure. Owning productive assets, even imperfectly, is safer than waiting perfectly. Partial ownership beats theoretical opportunity. Diversification matters, but diversification into what matters more. Assets that scale with inflation, scarcity, and policy protection perform differently than assets dependent on wages or fixed payments. This is why real assets, productive businesses, and certain financial instruments outperform during transitions. They are aligned with structural forces rather than cyclical optimism. The worst position is dependence on a single income source combined with delayed asset exposure. That combination guarantees vulnerability. This is why inaction is not neutral. It is a decision to remain exposed to forces you do not control. People often say they are waiting for clarity, but clarity arrives only after transitions complete. By then, the cost of entry has multiplied. The $45 trillion wealth shift does not reward foresight perfectly. It punishes delay relentlessly. Where the number comes from. Before you can understand where this wealth is going, you need to understand why the number itself is real. $45 trillion is not a headline figure pulled from thin air. It is not a social media exaggeration or a speculative forecast. It is the result of three forces converging at the same time: demographics, monetary policy, and asset ownership concentration. Let's start with demographics, because this is the part nobody can argue with. The baby boomer generation controls more wealth than any generation in human history. In the United States alone, households led by people over the age of 60 control roughly 70% of all private assets. That includes real estate, equities, bonds, businesses, and cash equivalents. Globally, the concentration is even more extreme in developed economies. Over the next 10 to 15 years, this generation will exit the workforce, downsize assets, transfer wealth, or liquidate holdings due to retirement, healthcare costs, or mortality. This is not a prediction. It is math. Economists and estate planners estimate that between $40 and $90 trillion will change hands globally as a result of this demographic transition. The conservative midpoint of those estimates is where the $45 trillion figure comes from. But here's the critical misunderstanding. Most people assume this wealth transfer flows cleanly from parents to children. That assumption is wrong. A significant portion of this wealth does not move through inheritance at all. It moves through markets. When retirees sell homes, stocks, and businesses to fund retirement or medical expenses, those assets don't disappear. They are bought. And the buyer is rarely a younger middle-class household. It is institutions, private equity, asset managers, sovereign funds, large corporations, high net worth individuals already inside the asset-owning class. This is where the wealth shift begins. Now layer monetary policy on top of demographics. For more than a decade, central banks suppressed interest rates to near zero. This environment punished savers and rewarded asset holders. Cash lost purchasing power. Bonds delivered negative real returns. Meanwhile, real estate, equities, and alternative assets inflated dramatically. This was not accidental. It was policy. Low rates made debt cheap. Cheap debt pushed asset prices higher. Those who already owned assets benefited disproportionately. Those who relied on wages and savings fell behind. Then inflation arrived. When inflation surged, central banks raised rates, but not fast enough to reverse the structural advantage asset holders had already gained. Instead, higher rates created a new problem: affordability. Younger households now face a world where housing prices are elevated, borrowing costs are high, and wages lag both. The result is exclusion. This is not a housing crisis. It is an ownership crisis. As older generations exit assets and younger generations cannot afford them, institutions step in. They have balance sheets. They have access to capital. They are not constrained by wage growth. This is how ownership shifts upward, not outward. Now look at asset ownership concentration. Over the last 15 years, the top 10% of households increased their share of total asset ownership dramatically. This includes stocks, real estate, and private businesses. Meanwhile, the bottom 50% saw marginal gains at best, often offset entirely by inflation. This concentration accelerates during transitions. When markets are stable, wealth gaps widen slowly. When markets shift, through rate changes, demographic transitions, or policy shocks, gaps widen quickly. That is what is happening now. $45 trillion is not being handed from one generation to the next in a neat transfer. It is being repriced, reallocated, and absorbed through financial markets under conditions that favor scale. This is why timing matters. If you already own assets, this transition protects you. If you don't, it prices you out. And here's the part most people miss entirely. This wealth shift is not happening in the future. It started years ago. It is simply accelerating now. We are in the middle phase, the phase where policy still feels temporary, where people believe things will normalize, where affordability is painful but not yet impossible. This is the most dangerous phase. Because once markets structurally adjust to a new ownership equilibrium, reversal becomes nearly impossible without systemic collapse. Let's talk about who is actually losing. Middle-class households dependent on wages, savings accounts, and fixed income instruments are the primary losers in this transition. Inflation erodes cash. High rates restrict borrowing. Asset prices remain elevated because institutional demand replaces retail demand. This creates a trap. You need assets to protect against inflation, but inflation makes assets unaffordable. That is not an accident. It is the result of policy sequencing. Now contrast this with asset managers. Large firms operate on a completely different plane. They raise capital globally. They borrow at institutional rates. They buy long-duration assets and hold through volatility. They benefit from inflation because asset values rise faster than liabilities. When retirees sell, these firms buy. When households can't afford mortgages, these firms rent. When volatility scares individuals, these firms deploy capital. This is how the $45 trillion moves. Not through inheritance papers, through market clearing. And here's the final piece of this part that changes how you see everything. Governments are structurally aligned with this shift. Pension systems depend on asset markets. Tax bases depend on capital gains. Debt sustainability depends on inflated asset values. There is no incentive to reverse this. Rising asset prices solve fiscal problems. Falling asset prices expose them, so policy, demographics, and capital all push in the same direction, upward, inward, concentrated. In the next part, we are going to look at how this wealth shift actually executes in real time, through housing equities, pensions, and debt markets, and why waiting for the right moment is the biggest mistake people make. Because by the time this shift feels obvious, it is already finished. How the shift actually happens. To understand how this wealth shift executes, you have to stop thinking in terms of dramatic events and start thinking in terms of mechanisms. There is no single crash, no single policy announcement, no single moment when ownership suddenly changes hands. Instead, the transfer happens through ordinary transactions repeated millions of times under extraordinary conditions. Housing is the clearest example. For decades, home ownership was the primary mechanism through which middle-class families accumulated wealth. Stable prices, affordable mortgages, and rising wages made ownership attainable. That system no longer exists. What replaced it is something very different. When interest rates were pushed to near zero, housing prices surged. Cheap credit allowed buyers to bid up prices far beyond what wage growth alone could justify. When inflation forced rates higher, prices did not fall proportionally. Instead, affordability collapsed. This is the critical distinction most people miss. High prices plus low rates produce bubbles. High prices plus high rates produce exclusion. Today's housing market is not overheated for institutions. It is inaccessible for households. A young family does not look at a home and see shelter. They see a monthly payment that consumes an unsustainable share of income. They step back. They wait. They hope prices will fall. Institutions do not wait. Large asset managers, private equity funds, and real estate investment vehicles evaluate housing very differently. They do not rely on wages. They rely on capital structure. They borrow at lower rates. They deploy equity strategically. They focus on long-term cash flows, not monthly affordability. When households hesitate, institutions acquire. This is not speculation. It is observable behavior. In many markets, institutional buyers account for a growing share of home purchases. They convert owner-occupied housing into rental stock. They accept lower yields initially because they are positioning for long-duration returns. They understand something most individuals do not. Housing scarcity is structural. Zoning restrictions, construction costs, labor shortages, and demographic demand all limit supply. Over time, scarcity supports prices. Rent follows. This is how ownership shifts without anyone announcing it. Equities tell a similar story. Most people assume stock markets are democratic. Anyone can buy shares. Ownership appears dispersed. In reality, ownership is increasingly concentrated. The majority of equities are owned either directly or indirectly by the top decile of households and by institutions managing pooled capital. Retirement accounts, pensions, endowments, and sovereign funds dominate market flows. When markets correct, individual investors often retreat. They sell to reduce risk. They wait for clarity. Institutions do the opposite. They rebalance. They deploy capital. They buy weakness. Why? Because volatility is not a threat to institutions, it is an opportunity. They are not constrained by emotion or short-term liquidity needs. They operate on multi-decade horizons. A temporary drawdown is irrelevant if long-term returns remain intact. Now layer demographics into this dynamic. As older generations draw down portfolios to fund retirement, they sell assets. Those assets must be absorbed by someone. Younger households facing affordability constraints and student debt burdens cannot absorb them at scale. Institutions can. This is the quiet handoff. It does not feel like a crisis. It feels like normal market activity. But ownership steadily concentrates. Pensions accelerate this process. Public and private pension systems are massive pools of capital. They require returns to meet obligations. Low interest rates force them into riskier assets. Private equity, infrastructure, real estate, and alternative investments became essential. These vehicles acquire assets directly. When a family-owned business is sold because the founder retires, it is often not another family that buys it. It is a fund. When infrastructure assets are privatized, they are not owned by citizens. They are owned by institutions. When rental housing expands, it is not mom-and-pop landlords. It is capital pools. This is the wealth shift in action. Debt markets play an equally important role. Governments carry unprecedented levels of debt. Servicing that debt depends on maintaining asset values. A collapse in asset prices would destabilize tax revenues, pensions, and financial systems simultaneously. As a result, policy responses consistently favor asset stability. This does not mean governments control markets perfectly. It means they intervene asymmetrically. Losses are socialized, gains are privatized. Liquidity appears when asset markets are under stress. It rarely appears to support wages or savings. This is not ideology, it is structural necessity. Debt-backed systems require asset inflation to remain functional. That reality aligns policy with asset owners. Now consider timing. Many people believe they are waiting for a correction to buy assets. They expect prices to revert to affordability. But corrections in a system like this do not restore access. They reshuffle ownership. When prices fall sharply, leverage matters more than income. Those with access to capital survive. Those without are forced out. This is why wealth transfers accelerate during volatility. The middle class loses liquidity. Institutions gain ownership. The $45 trillion does not move because people choose to give it away. It moves because conditions force transactions under unequal constraints. This is the difference between a fair market and a clearing market. In a clearing market, assets go to whoever can close. And closure requires capital, not income. The most important thing to understand is this. This phase does not last forever. Eventually, ownership stabilizes at a new equilibrium. At that point, entry becomes even harder. Prices no longer reflect utility. They reflect control. We are not there yet. We are in the transition. This is the window where positioning still matters. Positioning for a decade. That will not look like the last. The defining mistake people make during structural transitions is assuming that the future will reward the same behaviors that worked in the past. It rarely does. The next decade will not resemble the last one because the conditions that defined the last decade no longer exist. Cheap money is gone. Demographics have turned. Debt has reached saturation. Asset ownership has concentrated. Policy has shifted from growth optimization to system preservation. These are not cyclical changes. They are foundational. Positioning for this environment does not require extreme risk-taking or dramatic lifestyle changes. It requires understanding what is being protected and what is being sacrificed. Assets are being protected. Income is not. This is the core insight. Policies will continue to support asset values because they must. Pension systems, sovereign balance sheets, banking stability, and political legitimacy all depend on asset markets functioning. Allowing widespread asset deflation would create cascading failures that no government is willing to tolerate. This does not mean markets cannot fall. It means recoveries will be engineered, liquidity will appear, losses will be redistributed. Those who hold assets benefit from this asymmetry. Those who rely solely on income do not. This is why exposure matters more than optimization. Perfect allocation is less important than participation. Being early is less important than being present. The most resilient strategy is not chasing the highest returns. It is reducing dependency on a single system. This includes diversification across asset classes, geographies, and structures. It includes owning assets that generate cash flow, not just appreciation. It includes minimizing fixed obligations that cannot adjust with inflation. It also includes realistic expectations. The era of effortless gains is over. Returns will be uneven. Volatility will persist. Psychological discipline will matter more than technical skill. Avoiding catastrophic mistakes is more valuable than finding perfect opportunities. There are also things that do not matter as much as people think. Daily market noise does not matter. Short-term predictions do not matter. Political narratives matter less than structural incentives. What matters is whether you own something that benefits from scarcity, scale, and policy alignment. The wealth shift does not reward intelligence alone. It rewards positioning. People often ask when this process will end. That question misunderstands the nature of the shift. There is no finish line. There is a new equilibrium. Ownership will stabilize at a higher level of concentration. Entry will become more expensive. Volatility will diminish as control increases. This is how systems mature. The opportunity exists during the transition, not after it. That is where we are now. The $45 trillion wealth shift is not a headline event. It is a slow realignment of ownership driven by demographics, debt, and design. By the time it is universally acknowledged, it will already be complete. This is not a call to panic. It is a call to awareness. History does not repeat, but it does transfer. And the transfer is underway.